Hello and welcome everybody, and welcome to the last breakout session of today, Tuesday. I hope everybody's having a wonderful reInvent. I am Patrick Combs, and I'm the Worldwide Technical Leader for Healthcare and Life Sciences at AWS. And with me today is Arian Malik, the Senior Vice President of Product Development at Change Healthcare. And today we're going to be talking to you about healthcare data interoperability on AWS. So the number one question that I get asked in my role is really, not super exciting, but, very informative in a way. And it's how do I implement an interoperability solution on AWS? Which there's many layers to the question because the term has a special meaning in healthcare. Now, interoperability, when we think of it in other systems, really just kind of refers to the ability to transfer data around and utilize it when it gets transferred. But in healthcare, really, it's split out into about 4 different layers, right? And ranges from everything from the basic data transfer on one end to being able to create and enrich and derive insight from the data that you have on the other. And in between, there's the semantic and syntactic interoperability that we're looking for. And that's generally how it's defined. But the need for this is incredibly pressing these days. And the source of that question that I get is really from this very strong directive that our customers have to free up the data, make it available everywhere. And it's important to understand kind of how we got here in the first place. I mean, what are we trying to free up? It's not a stretch to say, for all of you involved in healthcare directly and then and others around it, it's not a stretch to say that healthcare probably is in need of some modernization. And that's kind of to put it lightly. The current state of healthcare is antiquated, right? The data is very effectively siloed. And it's siloed in a way, that's kind of put there by a lot of very monolithic solutions. These are things that we would consider to be sort of point solutions for very specific problems. They do a good job at what they do, but then they take their data and squirrel it away in one of these data silos. And they were never designed to communicate with each other, right? These different monolithic solutions that are out there were meant to just perform a function and exit. And so the sense of even being able to exchange data between these systems was non-existent until fairly recently. And so we're in this state right now where everything's locked up and unavailable to us, but we don't have a good way to kind of free it up and get it. And to that point, the key thing here is that this has been identified as the number one thing that's holding us back from really making a true transition in our healthcare system. And this is worldwide. So moving from that point of fee-for-service to real value-based healthcare is blocked by the availability and interoperability of data within healthcare itself. And even to the point where the Center for Medicare and Medicaid has renamed meaningful use, that thing that's supposed to be driving us to this value-based system, to become promoting interoperability, because they're trying to make everybody focus on just that alone, breaking up that iceberg. And we really encourage this. Here at AWS, what we view and what the team of which I'm a part view is our mission is to create an ecosystem for healthcare all around. And to us, that really compromises of about 4 essential things. It's building a home for the robust exchange of data. It's providing a way to scale these monolithic solutions that exist out there and really deliver the value of the cloud to the healthcare industry. It's to facilitate and promote communication with industry standard protocols right there. And then once we have all this data freed up, once it has become liquid, we hope to provide services to enrich, enhance, and provide insight into this data. And these are the kind of things that you see with the advent of Comprehend Medical and Transcribe Medical and these services that we've seen today. And we believe in this, really strongly because what we're trying to do is provide an example of how best to do it. That question I get about how to actually implement an interoperability solution on AWS, getting started has a very easy answer on AWS. All of the services necessary to do it are available already, and they can be utilized easily already. Now, we are very much advocating that people use FHIR, right? I know it's not spelled that way, but Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, brought to you by Health Level 7 International, has become the common standard or the driving standard nowadays for doing a lot of this healthcare interoperability and data exchange, and for many good reasons. And it's fairly easy to stand up a gateway to accept messages in FHIR-based format just with the services you see here. And you can take and bundle those resources, or you can send those messages one at a time through a different client process that you have set up, and then just send it to an API, to an endpoint that's already set up on the API gateway. And once that message arrives on the API gateway, it can be passed back to Lambda for some quick, checking, or even basic ETL that you want to do on the data that comes through, and then deposited on whatever service you like. So we, in the example that we provide, place it directly onto DynamoDB, which we like, just because of the flexibility that it offers. But of course, you could send this message to whatever other, maybe application or other resource that you have defined on AWS. And this example is available today for you to go take a look at and even stand up very quickly. And the services we engage with this are, again, available right now. There is not a lot of new things that have to be developed here in order to use this well on AWS, to at least get started. The API gateway, as you're all familiar with, is there to really just provide endpoints for the calls that we make. FHIR is a REST-based protocol, so it is easy to interpret on the API gateway and implement there. Lambda, of course, is used to process and just do a quick check on the message as it comes through. Now, the example we have that is available to you right now was implemented in Java and runs with the Jersey framework, but Lambda itself, our serverless service, is able to run any number of languages and frameworks that you choose. So you don't have to take our example for it. You can re-implement it however you'd like, and then really build a service that can deconstruct these messages and direct them where you need to be. Now, like I mentioned, the example uses DynamoDB. We use it because it is meant to be very flexible. The different resources defined in FHIR can vary in terms of the content they carry or the fields that they have. So without the rigid structure in place needed for a relational database, DynamoDB makes a good home to insert messages really quickly and then make them available and searchable as needed. And then if you want to utilize these things later on, bring them into a data lake or something like that, you can always place them directly on S3 and just leave them there for as long as you like. And then the particular solution that we have, or the example that we provide, we also want to make sure that people can utilize identity services like Cognito, and then take one of the really exciting services from reInvent's past, AWS X-Ray, and take a look at the message traffic all the way through. You can take a look at the Lambdas that you've built and do some real-time debugging, but you can also take a look at the message itself and validate its contents and do all that fun stuff. Now, really, why did we do this? And the text there, which I'm not going to read in its entirety unless you demand it, is the text that we submitted to the Health and Human Services press release that came out this summer. And there was a commitment that the government asked us to provide, and they asked a number of major technology players to provide a general commitment to the idea of promoting interoperability. And we do so enthusiastically, and this is how we responded. The drive behind it, again, is to provide better care for all of us overall, for everybody that's going to be a patient, which at some point in our lives is probably going to be everybody. And if the real barrier to achieving a system where people get proper care all the time is just data transfer and interoperability, this is a challenge that we can solve. This is something we can commit ourselves to actually helping break up. And so, we're excited to support this. We provide the examples. We're also very excited to work with our customers and partners to drive the implementation of these solutions, wherever they need to be. Broadly speaking, interoperability isn't meant to be just the creation or the ability to just trade data or anything like that. There's also the concept of a healthcare information exchange. Now, it comes in a few different flavors, but the exchange itself is meant to be a repository of essential patient healthcare data. And a number of the largest exchanges in the US run on AWS. But importantly, this concept is actually being adopted all over the world. We see the rise of exchanges in Europe. We see the use of exchanges now in Australia, New Zealand, and South America as well. So this is a concept that's building all over the place, and they're incredibly useful for patients all over the world, but especially patients within populations that move around a lot or experience a lot of churn or anything like that. And one of the most significant exchanges that's on AWS now is Commonwealth. And Commonwealth is operated by Change Healthcare, but is a not-for-profit health alliance that's dedicated to providing that core repository of healthcare data for exchange, without getting too circular there. And the value of the data that can be, or the value of the data within the exchange is something that we're happy to take a look at and help Change Healthcare really leverage and really free up for the benefit of patients everywhere. So here to tell you a little bit more about that is Arian, and begin to discuss bringing data liquidity to healthcare.
Awesome, thank you so much. Thank you for the intro and the setup. Maybe just a little bit about myself. I've been in both life sciences and then in healthcare for long enough that I've got a lot of gray hair. I've been working in interoperability, and that's where the rest of my gray hair comes from for quite a while. Did patient engagement, connecting patients to their own data, connecting networks around, local networks around data exchange, orders and results, that kind of thing. And then went to work for ONC, where I started the direct project and the standards interoperability framework. Have served on the HIT Standards Committee and now serve on the HIT Advisory Committee. And I now found myself leading a large R&D organization focused again on interoperability. So this has been the theme of my life. And if you look at the presentation I put together, a lot of that theme is how to scale interoperability because it's not enough in this country to do it here and there. We need to make it ubiquitous and available. So this will be no surprise to everybody, but we have a cost problem in the United States. Right now, we're sitting at about $3.5 trillion. It's projected to go to $6 trillion. And one of the things that I think people get a little wrong about healthcare spending and expenditures, they think it's primarily an issue of insurance companies, payers, employers. Every single dollar of healthcare comes out of your wallet. Every single one. So that $3.5 trillion, every single one of those dollars comes out of your wallet. And it comes out in terms of tax expenditure to pay for things like Medicare, Medicaid, federal employee benefits, military health system benefits, Veterans Administration through VHA, Indian Health Services, state and local employee benefits. And then it comes out of your wallet for paying for your premium. And there's both an employer and your contribution. But at the end of the day, that employer contribution is your dollars too. And then increasingly, it's coming out in terms of your direct dollar cost for things like co-pays, co-insurance, and an advent of high deductible plans and health savings accounts. A good portion of the financial responsibility is coming down on all of us. So this is an area that we should all care a great deal about. And getting ahead of it. We're in healthcare information technology, yay, healthcare is growing as a percent of GDP, but it's really an existential threat to us as a country, to our ability to operate, to do the kind of technology innovation that we're looking to do, because it's a stress and burden on us, but it's also a stress and burden on our economy. So how do we get at the cost problem in the U.S. healthcare system? And Brent Schaefer did a nice job this morning at the keynote of talking about a lot of these stats. And he looked at a $1 billion cost, and that includes both wasted care and a lot of the administrative waste in the US healthcare system. And if you look at the next closest comparator to the US in terms of cost of care, Switzerland, and when you actually look at the cost per capita of care, taking $1 trillion out of the 3.5 doesn't seem all that radical. So this comes out of a variety of data sources. This one comes from Don Berwick. Everybody's looked at this, has concluded more or less the same thing. There's a huge amount of waste and inefficiency in our system. A lot of that waste and inefficiency is because of the administrative complexity and inefficiency and lack of coordination of care. And if we got better at these areas, there's a significant portion of the dollars that are coming out of our own wallets that we could return back to our wallets and put to productive use in the economy. So, what's our goal here? My personal goal is generating the kind of healthcare experience that we have in some other countries. And that healthcare experience is one where we as patients go receive care, we go home, and a lot of how we pay for care, a lot of the administrative complexity just happens. How else do we pay for things in this modern age? We should have a digital experience where consumers can manage their own financial responsibility, understand what happened clinically, and do all this stuff in real time. That doesn't seem that crazy. It does seem crazy in this U.S. healthcare system, but it doesn't seem that crazy for those of us who can order a Starbucks from our mobile phones or consume services from AWS. So in order to do this, we need to lower the information complexity and points of friction across the US healthcare system by improving networks, and those networks need to be able to scale. So we have a scale problem in how we think about interoperability in this country, and we've got a lot of proof points. We know we can do it on a point-to-point basis. We know we can take a single ecosystem and do interoperability between those ecosystems. We know, because we did things like Commonwealth, that we can stand up large nationwide services and get exchange going back and forth. So we're going to first just give the obligatory, about Change Healthcare blurb, but it's really a statement about scale, and then go into a couple of case studies for how we can drive additional scale in interoperability. So who is Change Healthcare? Little known company, but we're sort of the glue in between the US healthcare system. So a lot of the work that we do is driving administrative efficiency in the country. Or if you like, we're driving administrative waste, but we're trying to drive administrative efficiency. And so, some of the stats that I like the most are, 14 billion healthcare transactions a year. And a lot of those transactions are the lifeblood of the US healthcare system, eligibility, claiming, that kind of thing. We connect and are pervasive across all of the US healthcare system, so connecting 900,000 physicians. That's pretty much more people that have AMA licenses. Pharmacies, dentists, we actually have a pretty ubiquitous dental network, labs across the country, and most of the hospitals in the country. We have an imaging group that does broad-scale deployment of imaging worldwide, and we process through our networks about $1 trillion of those $3.5 trillion of US healthcare expenditures, and have ubiquitous connections to payers as well. So in doing all of that stuff, we've had to solve a whole bunch of really interesting scale problems for how we not just make interoperability work from a standards perspective, but then also how we turn those standards into interoperability in practice, how we drive the level of scale and coordination that's required to connect all of those settings of care. So as Pat mentioned, a number of years ago, me and a buddy of mine at Cerner came up with this idea of doing nationwide patient record locator services. And the very simple thought was that the experience of looking up where a patient has been and with appropriate permissions and authorizations, pulling down that data in order to inform treatment, in order to provide it for the patient, and increasingly in order to drive other administrative and clinical activities. That should be ubiquitous, it should be nationwide, and it should be built into the health information technology the workflow systems that physicians and other clinical staff use on a day-to-day basis. And so, we did the usual, writing that on the back of a virtual napkin, sitting on the phone for quite a bit. And then we got our organizations together and founded a not-for-profit trade association called the Commonwealth Health Alliance. And we've been running at scale for quite a while now. And now we're at the point where we're starting to connect across networks. So there's a connectivity framework called Care Quality that's intended as the framework for different networks to connect to each other. And really, between Care Quality, we've connected the Commonwealth network to effectively the Epic Care Everywhere network. And we're seeing large amounts of volume of data transmit between those two different networks. So, we're seeing the promise of large-scale interoperability playing out. You see the map with all of the connection points, the number of patient lives who are connected, the number of records that are connected, and the like. And there's a lot of room to grow in this space. With the recent ONC and CMS proposed rulemaking, soon hopefully to come up with final rules relative to the trusted exchange framework, that we should see a broader rollout and adoption of interoperability. And one of the lesser known things that happened in 21st Century Cures, the law that Congress passed a couple of years ago, is that it starts to mandate that both health information technology vendors and provider organizations must share data when it's appropriate to do so. This is a little bit of a change in the U.S. healthcare system. We've operated on the premise that you can share data for HIPAA-permitted purposes. We've now flipped that around to say, well, if you don't share data for HIPAA-permitted purposes, you are an information blocker and you're subject to enforcement action. And so based on some of that, I expect some of these numbers to radically accelerate. So that drives a scale problem. We built the first version of the Commonwealth Health Alliance. So just to be really clear, Commonwealth Health Alliance is a not-for-profit trade association. They contract with us to run the service. And we built the first version of that service in 2013 in the way that you'd build the pretty cool version of that service in 2013. It was built in our data center, our rented data center. It was built on MongoDB and kind of chunky microservices. So it was pretty cool for its time. But as everybody knows, when you build in a data center, when you run out of headroom, it's really hard to start adding more capacity to scale dynamically. And then if you think about the problem of interoperability, indeed the problem of any of these administrative networks and clinical networks in the US healthcare system, they're inherently bursty. So you get way more queries for documents at 9 a.m. On a Monday than you do at 12 p.m. on a Saturday. And we made an announcement last year that we were going to take these services, the underlying services that power the Commonwealth Health Alliance, and turn them into services that are available for free nationwide. That obviously drives a significant scale problem as well. So we had a challenge. We had to modernize this architecture and figure out how to scale it in order to address the needs of increased interoperability, the post-21st Century Cures Act world, and driving down the cost of interoperability so that more people can partake of it. And the first stage of this is a lift and shift migration, followed very quickly by a radical re-architecture of how we're doing things, really focused on a cloud-native stack. And we could go into a lot of detail about some of the key issues, but I just point out a few things. Number one is this approach allows us to take advantage of elasticity. So using services like EKS or ECS to drive microservices. In particular, the announcement about Fargate for EKS is fantastic. We're using in other areas Fargate for ECS, and the ability to just consume stuff when it happens is tremendous for a network that needs to scale up and scale down overnight. moving off of big, heavy document database stores like MongoDB that need to be sized appropriately for peak transactions, and be able to tier storage off to things like S3 for large-scale data storage, but using Elasticsearch and DocumentDB for stuff that requires a shorter SLA. Really, really important for us in order to enable a cost-sipping network that can scale up to the demand. So when we get hammered with queries by Care Everywhere, Epic customers who are looking for data, or when we light up other networks, it just happens. It just scales up, and it scales up in a cost-effective way, so that we're not buried under AWS consumption. So that's Commonwealth. The bulk of Change Healthcare from an interoperability perspective are our administrative transaction platforms. These are the things that do eligibility, claiming, remittance, all the stuff, all the mechanics involved with getting you paid and getting your providers paid for services rendered when you go receive care. And increasingly, things like eligibility are becoming real-time in clinical workflow transactions. So if you walk into an ED, which I had the misfortune to do a little while ago, if you walk into an ED, you'll see one of the first steps is to verify your health insurance, running it through an eligibility network and making sure that you've got that information correct. Well, what does that do? When you walk out of the hospital, for everything else that the US healthcare system's messed up about, you're not going to have the problems you used to have of getting billed to the wrong card and having to go sit on the phone forever trying to make sure that your transactions get rebilled to the right card. A really critical part of the infrastructure for how we deliver care. So we process a significant amount of the U.S. healthcare system's claiming volume, significant portion of the overall transaction volume. And we did so on a company that we brought together, and so there's a whole bunch of data silos and monoliths that Pat was mentioning. And so we're building a net new network, and that net new network we call IMN, the Intelligent Medical Network. We're driving that again on some of the same considerations, on using techniques like ECS with Fargate, to drive serverless consumption. Well, that's important because, again, we get hammered with eligibility transactions the first week of the new year, or the first month of the new year, as everybody walks in and needs to reconfirm because your benefits have changed. Hammered. And then at other times, there's absolutely nothing going on. Or we've got customers who will send massive batches of claims, want to get those adjudicated, cleared out of the system. And the faster and better we do that, the faster and better we get the remittance back, we get the adjudication to happen, and the faster and better, at least the impact to your wallet's clear. We want to work on reducing the actual cost of that, and so getting things to more real-time, drive more real-time claiming and remittance is a critical aspect of this overall network. So again, similar scale problems and similar approaches to technology, using services that allow us to scale up and scale down very quickly, using storage very intelligently, making sure that S3 is our primary storage mechanism, that we're not putting a ton of data into low latency storage that's really expensive to operate, and being very thoughtful about how we observe the network that we're running, because when you're running 14 billion transactions, even if your error rate's very, very low, the actual volume of error is very, very high. And so being able to build observability into the network using capabilities like AppMesh is incredibly important. And then increasingly, we want to drive transformation on this technology incrementally. And again, AppMesh has been really critical for us to think about how we do canary testing. So if we launch a new version of some of our underlying eligibility microservices, we don't want to cause significant issues, significant downtime. These are high reliability networks. They need to operate at 5 nines. So we need to be able to introduce changes into our networks gradually, test them over with a subset of volume, see where the errors are. If everything's good, we bleed all the traffic over and deprecate the old service. Our ability to have tools that enable that kind of operation is really, really critical. And if you're just doing interoperability on a few patients at a time, a few lookups at a time, those issues, those concerns may not seem that pressing. But when you're doing billions and billions of transactions, that becomes a really important consideration. Now, increasingly, the work that we did in Commonwealth was, I think, the first deployment of FHIR. Now, it was FHIR before it was DSTU2. So I think it was the first deployment of a FHIR-like set of services ever. That may be hyperbole, but it was one of the early deployments of a set of FHIR-like services. We've since upgraded the entire Commonwealth stack to be full FHIR STU compliant and compatible. But that is an API platform. So our partners, the health IT technology vendors, consume all of those services via APIs with self-service portals that themselves are surfaced via APIs. And the onboarding experience for somebody getting started with Commonwealth is really, really simple. We have a little checklist. All the API specs are clearly and well documented. We've got a developer experience, developer portal, and people go connect. The experience of EDI connectivity is not nearly as fun. I once had the privilege of doing adjudicated clinical transactions for a patient-physician connectivity where we had a reimbursed web visit. And in those days, we wanted to do eligibility because we needed to check the benefit and pre-adjudicate that benefit. We needed to drop claims in so that the provider got paid for the services rendered. And as a startup company with a lot of really, really smart technologists who knew .NET and how to build scalable application services, EDI was a little bit of a pain. There's a Microsoft product whose name is seared in my memory that I keep trying to forget, BizTalk, that we struggled with for quite a long time. It was not easy. We also did the same thing for e-prescribing, so we built e-prescribing, and we had to go learn NCPDP and all the ridiculosity of how line breaks work and loops and segments and all that good stuff. Nobody likes that. And if you build now an application like we built, boy, that was a long time ago. 15 years ago. So if you build an application like that from the ground up now, you go pull down an API, and there are API specifications for eligibility, claiming, claim status, remittance, in the same way that you do when you connect to Commonwealth. It's really transformed the way that innovators start to access healthcare. And if we want to transform and bend the cost curve of the U.S. healthcare system, it's not just scale providers and middleware providers like we do. We also need innovators, technology innovators who've got a brand new idea, and a lot of those brand new ideas require, for example, checking eligibility and doing claims. So we've taken a lot of those capabilities, published them via APIs, and launched a set of API ecosystems, and now we're increasingly bringing those to the AWS marketplace. And the goal here isn't just the API marketplace is pretty cool. It's that the developer experience is really, really important to us. So the developer experience should be go down, pull down a version of the API, test it in a console, but then go through a full marketplace experience where you can self-provision your connectivity, enter in your financial details, and just start running against these services. And increasingly, we believe that this is the way the U.S. healthcare is going to go, that FHIR-based APIs, API access to some of these old defunct clearinghouses that we do huge amounts of volume through, it will transform to digital startups who are pulling down APIs from a marketplace. So, we've got right now significant numbers of transactions going through our API-based connectivity points. So 55 million a month now going through, primarily eligibility going through this. We're launching, I believe, next week, availability in the AWS marketplace. And we built this, we actually built the API platform natively on AWS, and a lot of the same constructs of small microservices that scale up and scale down. So we've got sub hundreds of millisecond total end-to-end transaction times that we run through. The cost consumption for just the API portion is 0.04 of a penny per API transaction that we run through. That's not the full stack. That's not the full power of doing eligibility. It's just that API piece. But it just proves that you can do high-scale transactions relatively inexpensively if you architect them the right way. And as I mentioned, the goal here is to drive additional interoperability and additional access to some of these systems. So, in conclusion, interoperability is one of the ways that we're going to bend the cost curve in the U.S. healthcare system. It is a really critical part of how we're driving toward a more consumer-friendly U.S. healthcare experience. It's a critical part of how we drive to a patient-centered clinical experience. And it is a required part of doing business in the U.S. healthcare system with regulatory mandates like 21st Century Cures. And so our ability to drive scale through those networks, your ability to drive scale through those networks, your ability to drive additional connectivity points into the U.S. healthcare system is a critical part of how we're going to drive down the cost of the U.S. healthcare system. So I'm going to turn it back over to Pat. There's a few more housekeeping items.
Yep. Thank you. And thanks, Arian. So just as a kind of quick conclusion, this is our basic mission statement. As an industry group within AWS, we feel that we want to make sure that we work with our customers and partners to enable digitally enhanced, data-driven healthcare. And what that means is kind of what you've begun to see at different re:Invents that we've had over the past couple of years is services designed with healthcare in mind, that we're helping to drive the adoption of cloud as the new normal within healthcare. And our hope here is that these things combined together, along with the very specific industry expertise brought by our customers and partners, will begin that transformation of medicine to be a truly personalized experience for everybody. So this is the last session for today, but I'd like to remind everybody that we have some other healthcare sessions and workshops coming up for the rest of the week. Most notably, for anybody who wants to get hands-on keyboard with a lot of the material that I described earlier in this talk, there is a workshop on healthcare data interoperability tomorrow morning, and then other chalk talks and good sessions throughout the week. And a lot of these and a few of these interactive sessions can be had at our Healthcare and Life Sciences Networking Lounge, which is actually just down on this floor, a little bit over there. So if you have any questions afterwards or any follow-ups you would like to have or loud complaints that you'd like to deliver, we'll be happy to talk to you down there after the session. But more importantly, I hope that all of you will be able to join us as a reward for sticking through this entire thing. Would join us tonight at Otoro, which I understand is across the street. But tonight we have an industry reception, cocktail reception that we're putting on. So I hope to see you all there. And I would just ask you that when you have an opportunity, please complete the session survey in your mobile application. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.